how much influence does what they have on what we have? Think about it for a second. How much influence does, what maybe your parents have, and you're sort of driven by trying to live up to, the home that you grew up in? Or maybe how much influence does what your buddies from college, those knuckleheads that never study but now got a lot of stuff, does that really drive you, right? Maybe it's your siblings, right? Maybe it's your cousins. How much influence does what they have on what you have, right? You have that house in the block that's like everybody else has the big fancy brand new cars. Everybody always has a brand new car, and you have like a 5-year-old car, and you're feeling like, oh man, my car is so old, right? I mean, we need to be honest with ourselves. How much influence does what they have on what we have, right? How much does that move us and push us towards wanting to get more, to sort of compete with them, even though we may not use that language or even think that thought? There is a piece of that. I mean, think about it. What would we have, what would we buy, what would we own if we didn't know what everybody else had? Would we have all the stuff we have if we didn't know other people had that stuff? I mean, because I'm guessing you have, some drawers and cabinets, you have some closet space, you have some attic space, you have some storage space, you have a place that's supposed to hold your car that doesn't hold your car, that you got stuff in, right? And a lot of that stuff you have because, man, so you saw somebody else had it, right? Or, guys, we go to Home Depot or Lowe's and we walk the aisles looking. We just went there for some sandpaper, but it's like, man, I didn't know they had that. Look at that. We get all caught up. And ladies, you're not cut out of this because I know you got to do the exact same thing, right? But what would we have? Let's be honest. What would we have? What would we buy? What would we own if we didn't know what everybody else had? Would we have as much as we have? See, here's the reality. Our problem is we know too much. We know too much, right? We know about what others have because we see all their postings, right? The blessing of social media is people share their lives, at least the lives they want us to see, right? And they show us on this great vacation, this great meal, and look at me, I look at my brand new car. Look at how wonderful and perfect everything is in my life. And because we know that, we're like, oh, right, maybe that's how life's supposed to be, because it seems like everybody puts those kind of pictures up there, right? Not only do we know too much, we also know what we don't have, because we see what they have, right? Or we hear what they have, because our kids come home and say, do you know what the Jones or the Smiths or the, Adelagbys have, and it gets shared, right? And it's like, oh, well, and it gets kind of, and we know, and because then that begins to do something in us. Not only that, we also know what we could have, because we're constantly bombarded with the things we could have and that we're told we should have. If you're going to be happy and satisfied in life, you really need this thing. And the problem is, with all this knowledge, what ends up happening for all of us is this, that we end up being dangerously discontented. Not just discontented, but dangerously discontented. Because what happens is we're enticed toward the edge of financial ruin, right? Either off a cliff or into a wall, one way or the other, right? We're enticed to get more stuff because more stuff has to be better because more is always, that's what we tell ourselves, right? And we're driven to more debt, right? And credit cards are a great tool, but the problem is they're a great tool if you pay it off at the end of the month. If you don't pay it off at the end of the month, you soon figure out it's no longer a tool. In fact, maybe you're now the tool. But we're sort of like we had to have this. We didn't think in the moment. And what we end up doing is we get stuff that we didn't really want in the first place, or we get stuff that we sell later for half the price that we paid for it because we didn't need it. And this is not just a religion. This is not a religion. This is just a people thing, right? This happens to people of all faith, religions, backgrounds, any kind of things, age brackets, nationalities. Because we all live in a culture that constantly reminds us of what others have. Constantly. And what that ends up doing in your soul and in my soul is that we end up with a life of dissatisfaction with what we have, right? Because it isn't new, it isn't the latest, right? I mean, I got, my phone isn't the latest one. It's like the last one, and it was the latest 6 months ago, but now it's not the latest anymore. And it's like, what am I going to do when my friends have the newest one? And so we get dissatisfied with what we have, and we also end up discontent with what we don't. It bothers us that we don't have that. So I thought I'd do a little history lesson for just a moment. Some of you are old enough that you will believe this when I share this. Others of you will not believe me when I say these words, all right? But let's start off once upon a time. Once upon a time, people used things until they didn't work anymore. Which some of you are thinking, who would do that, right? I mean, there's brand new stuff. I mean, stuff is getting new all the time. There's newer, there's better, there's faster, right? There's cooler stuff. Why would you wait until it didn't work anymore to get something new? But there was a time, once upon a time, people used things until they didn't work anymore. And once it didn't work anymore, and once they tried to repair it, and it didn't get kind of repaired, once it was like, they couldn't fix it, then they might get something new. And once upon a time, when things broke, people would fix them. Which I know for some reason is like crazy. Why would somebody fix it? You just go buy a new one. In fact, that's why we like it when stuff breaks, is because we get something new. But it was true. Once upon a time, when things broke, people fixed them. And also once upon a time, if people didn't have something, they'd use what they had to do what they needed to do. They'd make do to do what they needed to do. Which were like, why wouldn't they just go out and buy the thing they needed? Life has changed dramatically, right? And in some ways it's for the better, but not always for the better because of this whole discontent that drives us, right? This whole marketing. And marketing is not a bad thing, it's just a thing, right? But there is a goal behind marketing, and that's get us to buy whatever they're trying to sell. And the reality is every day we see stuff we didn't know we needed until we saw it, until we were told about it. I mean, I was thinking about this week. I'm online looking at something, and actually I was checking my emails, and one of my email accounts has a side that always puts up ads for stuff, right? And it just pops up, and I'm like, oh, what is that? Let me click on that, right? Because I haven't seen that before. Wow, look at it. And I go on this rabbit chase, and there's 15 minutes of my life I'll never get back, but it's like, oh, right? We see this thing we didn't know about, and it could fix this. It could be the answer to that, right? I didn't even know how they could create something like that. And if you've ever shopped online, you've gotten those wonderful reminders of things like this. Or this one. Yeah, you all know, right? It's like amazing. It's so helpful, right? They're telling me of all the other stuff that I hadn't thought about that I might need when I bought this one thing, right? What if the problem isn't that we don't have, but the awareness of what we could have? What if that's the thing that just hits the right spot in your life and in my life, right? It just touches that right thing, that it's a reminder that we don't have this, and if we had this, this would happen, or that could happen, right? Now, this whole idea of being discontented with life is not a new thing. Right? It's not necessarily a modern thing. It's been around, I think, probably as far long as humans have been around. And 2,000 years ago, there was a guy named Paul who was a devoutly religious Jewish person who hated Christians. So if you kind of don't really like us Christians, you should be a fan of Paul's, right? Because he hated Christians. But at one point, his whole life turned in a different direction. He then became a follower of Jesus. And he's a guy who had been very successful in his role as a Jewish leader. He'd been well-schooled, well-educated, had a predominant role. And the impression we get from reading little we know about his life is that there was a time when he was well off. We would call him rich, that he was doing all right. And then there was a time when he began to kind of go out and follow Jesus that led him to begin to travel. And I think he began to spend a lot of those resources to try to make things work. And so he has this unique perspective of somebody. In fact, one of his letters he writes, he says, I know what it's like to have a lot, and I know what it's like to have a little. Which is helpful because sometimes we think when people talk about contentment and riches and money and all that stuff, we think it's just because they've never had it. But Paul's like, no, I've been there. In fact, we know about Paul. He's probably the second most influential person from Jesus, just around Jesus' time, because obviously Jesus is the most important. But Paul is the guy who writes a bunch of letters, wrote the majority of the part of the Bible we call the New Testament. And in one of his letters, he's writing to a guy named Timothy, who Timothy is a guy that he's sort of taken under as his mentee, right? That Paul becomes his mentor, and he begins to kind of write letters and bring him on trips and begins to kind of educate him and help him to grow into this role of watching over some of the churches that Paul starts, sort of becomes a pastor. And so a lot of it's about advice about how to do that. But in his first letter that we have that he writes to Timothy, he's talking about, I'm going to give you a little background. In chapter 6, he's talking about people who have decided that being religious is a way to make some money. You know, they come up with the conspiracies, they cause disturbances, they take sides, they kind of pit people against each other, and then they kind of say, we're the last bastion of the true things, right? And so send us money so that we can push back against all that. This is not something just new because it's like all over the place today, but it was actually back there 2,000 years ago. And Paul says, hey, some people thought that's the way to make money. They're wrong. I mean, you can make money at it, but they're not doing it for the right reasons, right? And as he gets done writing about that to Timothy, because apparently Timothy is running into some of these lovely people who, are always critical and always conspiracies and always, all the stuff behind it and are telling stories just like to stir things up, he writes these words. He says, but serving God, godliness does bring great profit. Because he's saying, hey, they're that's their path to riches is kind of, look at us, we're the ones you ought to support. And he says, I want to be clear with you, Timothy, because you're in this. There is profit. There is a payoff of living a godly, of following God with our life, of making, seeking his kingdom, as we sang just a few moments ago. There is something that's beneficial to that. But he also adds that little word at the end. You see the little word at the end of the second line? If, right? If's always a big thing because it's a clarifying word, right? It's a reminder that happens, but it doesn't just happen by itself. There's an if that goes along with it. And he says, listen, serving God, godliness does bring great profit if we are satisfied with what we have, if it's accompanied by contentment. In other words, if we don't kind of see that the thing that we're doing is a way to, in his case, use this religious thing to make money, let's do it some more to make more money, just be content. That contentment is this huge gain that he talks about that comes from this. That's really the reward. To be okay with being okay. To simply being fine with what we have. Which is a hard thing, but it was a hard thing back then as well. And then Paul begins to kind of explain why this is so true. And he writes something that we've probably maybe thought about for just a moment in our lives, but not too long because it's kind of a downer thing. But he says, listen, we brought nothing into the world. That when you came into the world, it was just you and you didn't have clothes, right? You were just a naked little baby, right? Crying, wah, wah, wah. That's all you brought was you and your wow, right? He says, listen, we didn't bring anything into this world. And I think he says this not just to remind us of how basic the start was, but it's a reminder that how we equate our value with our jobs and our salary and our positions and our house and our cars and our education, with our stuff, right? And Paul's saying, that's not what brings value. In fact, what if we were of value before we had anything? And you had value to your parents, hopefully. Hopefully you had loving, caring parents. And you brought joy to those parents, right? Especially if you're the first child, because this is so fantastic. I have no idea what I'm doing, right? So again, if you're the first child, you were the practice child. So thank you on behalf of somebody who wasn't a first child, because all of us who weren't benefited from your presence, right? But we equate things. But what if we had value before we had anything, right? Again, he wrote, listen, we brought nothing into the world. Let's not forget that. We brought nothing in the world, and so we can take nothing out. You didn't have any pockets when you came in. You not have any pockets when you go out, right? Simply put, in other words, he's saying we're not leaving with anything. In fact, we're leaving everything. There used to be a bumper sticker last century, actually, I remember seeing. That said that he who dies with the most toys wins. Some of you saw this. Some of you are old too. All right. And it was this idea, hey, look at me, I got all my stuff, I'm going to win. You're not going to win. Your family's going to win. Maybe the state's going to win. Other people are going to win, but you're not winning, right? Because you're dead. You're gone. We're leaving everything. Which leads me to a thought of a question I think we all ought to consider for just a moment. And it's one of those deeply personal questions, or at least it can be. Other than stuff, what will we leave behind? Now again, your offspring, your siblings, your family members are going to be thrilled that they got some stuff in general. They're not going to be thrilled that they have to go through your house and go through everything that should have gone through before, right? But other than our stuff, what are we leaving behind? What are the things that we hope will be talked about on that day when people gather to remember us? Something just to think, I don't want you to think too long, but I think it's important to consider that because I think how we answer that question can help us with this whole idea of our discontent and our content, of somehow reconciling that. And Paul's point when he says, listen, we came into the world with nothing, we're not taking anything out with us, it's simply this reminder that life is about more than stuff. Even though me just saying that, some of you still don't believe that that's true. But life isn't about stuff. Now, let me be clear. Stuff isn't bad, right? Stuff's good. We enjoy stuff. Stuff can bring joy to us, right? Can make life easier. Stuff isn't bad in and of itself. The reality is it's just a poor gauge of life. We think it means somebody was successful, right? Maybe it just means somebody went bankrupt. In fact, Jesus was really clear about this idea that life is about more than stuff. When he almost said those exact words one time, he said, listen, after talking about this topic about money, right, and our relationship to it and what it does, he's going to tell, after this, he's going to tell one of his famous made-up stories, right, that we didn't look at in this series, but is very on point about, having stuff and how we're storing stuff and thinking, well, now we got all this stuff, we can just sit back and enjoy it, and that isn't how it always works out. He simply said, life is not measured by how much one owes. It does not consist of how much one owes. And it's a pushback to the cultures that have been around for thousands of years, where life has been symbolized by what somebody owns, and maybe owes as well. And here's the question I want to ask all of us, even if you're not a follower of Jesus, but if you follow Jesus, it's a really important question. But even if you're not, what if that's true? What if what Jesus said was true, that life doesn't consist in the abundance of the stuff we have, right? How many storage units that we're paying monthly to store stuff that we haven't seen in months, right? Maybe a question just to help us is simply this. Don't we want more than stuff? Think about your life. Don't you want more than just stuff in your life? Again, stuff is nice, stuff is good, right? But stuff is still stuff. Think about the things that I think most of us would choose over stuff if it became a choice between stuff and these things. Aren't those the things that we really want more than stuff? To have love in our lives, to have respect, to have our lives be respected, to have a sense of purpose and meaning to our lives. In fact, Paul, after saying, listen, we wouldn't bring anything in this world, we're not going out with it. Oh, by the way, but if we have food and clothes, we're going to be satisfied with that. Paul's describing the life that he has chosen as he became a follower of Jesus and walked away from his former life and his former roles that he had within the Jewish faith of being this Pharisees, this leader for them. And this isn't just a bare bones, as long as I have a little bit of food and some clothes, I'm good. This is really more an attitude and an action, a choice that he had decided to make about how life works. And as long as I got food and I got clothes, which in a lot of places in the world, that's the necessities, and if people have that, if they have that a steady kind of thing, they're actually considered middle class, even though we would look at them and say they're not middle class. They would be middle class because having steady food, steady clothes, and a steady place to live. I mean, what more do you really need? And I know you're thinking, well, Mike, you need a nice place to live. You need some wheels. You need a car. You need a car to get around, right? I know all that stuff. But he's just making this point that says, listen, if we have food and clothes, that ought to be enough for us. Not enough for us that we ought to try to live down that, but enough for us that whether we have a lot or little, as long as those things are, that should be the satisfying piece of life. Then he goes on and gives some warnings to Timothy to not to talk specifically to Timothy, but to help Timothy as he talks to rich people. He says, listen, those who want to become rich, here's what happens to them. They bring temptation to themselves and are caught in a trap. They bring temptations to themselves and are caught in a trap. Just think about that for a second. What if there are specific temptations and specific traps for people whose focus is always more? Things like, people who bought this, bought that, right? Oftentimes bought with this. You might want to consider looking at this, right? And think about the reality of traps. Traps are things designed to capture, to harm, and to kill. And when Paul says, listen, those who, are so moved by money and its hold it has on them, set themselves up for some specific temptations that people that aren't that way don't experience. And some traps that capture them, that'll harm them, that ultimately will kill them, maybe not literally, but in a lot of figurative ways. But he goes on and describes, he says, listen, those that really have that desire, desire many foolish and harmful things that will ruin and destroy people. And I think when he says they will ruin and destroy people, it doesn't just mean those people, but also the people they come into contact with. Because I think most of us probably know some rich people. Maybe just a handful, right? And I know some really good rich people, and I know some not so good rich people, right? And what that money has done to them and how they see that money. And I ought to speak to all of us when we think about just the pressure of our culture to make more, to get more, to have more, to get more, to go through the whole process, right? Because what if by not letting ourselves be satisfied, we prevent ourselves from being satisfied? What if when he says, they bring their own temptations, maybe that's the temptation, but I'm not going to be satisfied, so I can't be satisfied because I'm not going to make that choice, and thus I just bring that temptation and I bring that trap that keeps circling and circling and circling, that keeps entwining me, keeps me having me give my credit card, tag my credit card, and then I see my bill and I can't pay my bill, and then I got to keep going and going and going. In other words, what Paul's saying is, what if our discontent is dangerous to us? What if it's dangerous in a lot of ways, not just in our bank account ways, but even how it begins to affect, our psyche and how we see life and what do we see as the purpose of life? Because the reality is we don't think it's that dangerous, right? Even sitting here right now, you're kind of thinking, yeah, Mike, you're not talking to me because I don't got that kind of money. Money's a thing, is a deal to me, but it's not like a big, big deal. It's like just a big deal, right? And then Paul writes that famous statement that if you've been around a church, maybe you don't have to be a church, you've heard this just in life because sometimes it gets thrown out, right? It's one of those things that gets said and people look at it and they go, right? The love of money causes all kinds of evil. Literally, the love of money is the root of all evil. That money is the source that drives, lots of really bad stuff that happens. Fraud, theft, murder sometimes. Scams that happen to get people's money. I don't know if I watch a lot of documentaries and kind of, people talking about stuff. I've watched them on this whole idea of the scam culture that's out there, right? People that live, most of them in other countries who are scamming people. And when they've made their way to talk to these people, the answer is, do you feel bad about, what you've done to these people? And the answer is always, no, I don't know these people, right? I'm just worrying about myself. I'm trying to make a living here in my own, where I live. So it's all about them, and it's not about the damage they've done. And it really does cause all kinds of terrible, terrible things. So let me just ask kind of a clearing question for all of us, just to do a little self-check, all right? Let's do a little self-check this morning. How do we know if we love too much money? If the money is the love of money is the root of all evil, right? Is the source, is the thing behind it. How do we know if we love money too much? Let me give you 3 questions we ought to ask ourselves to help figure that out. What are we willing to do for it? How far are we willing to kind of shade things or curl things or, not be honest about things or even make some really, really poor choices because it's about money, right? What are we willing to do for it? Who are we willing to hurt for it? Because sometimes in our pursuit of money, you got to step on some other people, and are we the attitude of some people are, which is, that's just business, right? And if you have a family, this one is maybe one of the more important ones. Who or what gets prioritized behind our pursuit of it? Has the pursuit of money become so big that we make it the most important thing? And I know you would love to sit and kind of clarify. You'd love to come up here, grab the mic and say, Mike, no. I'm just trying to provide for my family. And I appreciate you trying to provide for your family. You should. But my pushback would simply be a very simple question. One word. Really? Really? Are you just trying to provide for your family? Really trying to provide for your family, or are you trying to provide what you think you need to provide for your family? Because they need more stuff. And that's what you've kind of sort of told yourself is the sign of success. The sign of providing for your family is that my kids have everything they ever want. Your kids should never have everything they ever want. Just a little advice. They should have everything they need, but they should never have everything they want. Because we've all been kids. Some of us are like just old kids, right? And if we got everything we want, life we think would be great, but maybe not so much. And Paul says, as he writes, that this pursuit of money has a particular impact on the people that Timothy was working with, followers of Jesus. He says, listen, some people have left. They've strayed. They've wandered from the faith because they wanted it. That money became such a big, big deal to them that they were willing to step away from following God, from being a follower of Jesus. They're willing to make that the most important thing, even though Jesus was really clear about what was the most important thing. But Paul says, while they've done that, it hasn't always been easy for them. But sometimes it's not comforting for them because it is, listen, they have caused themselves much sorrow. They've pierced themselves with many pains because they've done this. So what if some of our pain, our frustration, our discontent is self-inflicted? What if, wow, it's great to kind of blame our culture and all the stuff out there. What if there's something in all of us that resonates with this more is better? And if more is better, more is more better. But thankfully, Paul doesn't leave it just with this is bad, right? He offers some advice on how to be content. To push back on more and not necessarily have less, but to be content with what we have. And here's how he puts it. He says, but you, man of God, ladies, don't be offended. He was writing to a guy named Timothy, right? So he's talking to him, and this is mentee, so he's kind of, you're a man of God. But you, man of God, run away from all those things. Flee all those things. Get up and take off, which seems like a pretty extreme thing to do, right? But he's reminding us of how dangerous it is. In fact, he says, you ought to get up and flee. And instead of just kind of, doing all that stuff, you ought to chase after, you ought to pursue a right relationship with God. You ought to pursue righteousness. Right living is another way to look at it. To push back on this, pursue something different than the money. Pursue this relationship with God, this right living, right? Not only that, you ought to pursue a godly life, godliness. You ought to pursue faith. You ought to pursue love. You ought to pursue patience, this idea of perseverance and endurance. And you ought to pursue gentleness. Long list, right? And his point is simply that if something has first place in our life, the way to make it not have first place is to replace it, right? Is to put something else in the place of that thing. Not just kind of keep telling ourselves, I'm not gonna, but actually put something else that we can pursue after, instead of pursuing after that. But he goes on and uses a term that you may not recognize. This is where it comes from. He says, fight the good fight of faith. Grabbing hold of a life that continues forever, this idea of eternal life. Fighting the good fight of faith for Paul in this context was fighting the good fight of faith that pushes back against our discontent, that pursues contentment with what we've been provided. But Paul doesn't stop there. In fact, he gives Timothy some advice on what he needs to do as a leader in his local church. He says, command those who are rich in the present age not to be proud, not to be arrogant, not to be jerks. Jerks is the word I'm going to go for. Jerks, right? If you're rich, because we all know, if you've known some rich people, sometimes they can be a little jerky, right? Kind of arrogant, kind of, hey, I got money, thus I can do whatever I want. You can't tell me because I have money, right? And he says, command those that are that way, not to be that way, right? Knock it off. Now, notice he said something initially. He said, those who are rich in this present age, which most of us are thinking right now, it's not me. But let me help dissuade you of that idea. Rich is those of us who have Amazon Prime accounts and aren't afraid to use them. Anybody else with me? Right. I mean, comparatively speaking, if you live in the United States, if you're in this space, you are a rich person. So when he says, command those, I'm not going to command you today. I'm just going to suggest to you, right, that if you're rich, don't be a jerk about it, right? Don't put it in other people's faces, right? The people that I know that are rich, that handle it so well, most of you would not know they're rich. It's not because they don't like nice things. It's just that that's not their way of communicating who they are. Their richness is not who they are. They're not defined by their richness, even though we kind of think, well, it'd be nice to, not be defined by it, because I'd like to be defined by it. But he doesn't leave it there. He says, listen, tell them, the rich people, right, to hope in God, not in their uncertain riches. Because we all ought to know that riches have an uncertainty to them, right? They've come, but they can also go, and they can go pretty rapidly. You can lose a job, right? And you might be able to replace that job, but sometimes it's hard to replace it for the numbers you were getting before. You have your money invested, and then somebody absconds with the money, or the market tanks, or whatever you invested in didn't turn out. Chinchillas weren't the next, answer to the mink stole, right? That's an old joke, so some of you, older folks will figure that one out, right? But that was a thing, right? Raising chinchillas, these little fuzzy animals, because they were going to be this great industry, and you just end up with 100 chinchillas, right? Which I don't think are very tasty, so I don't know what you do with them. But don't trust in your riches. Put your hope in God, he says. And I want you to notice something. Paul is not saying being rich is bad. He says if you find yourself that's okay, right? So he isn't kind of saying, you got there because you made it all about more. No. Sometimes things just happen. People get rich. But he's trying to remind us, if we're in that status, in that category, that how we choose to act in that category is so much more important than that we're in that category. Then Paul drops a bombshell that when I put it up on the screen, some of you are going to think, Mike, that cannot be in the Bible. But it is. God richly gives us everything to enjoy. If you're rich, God's given you all that stuff and you ought to enjoy it. Paul's not saying you ought to get rid of it, right? It isn't this, you got way more than you need, so you need to have less than you need. He's not making that argument. He's just saying, listen, our God's a good God. And he's richly given us everything to enjoy. Everything is everything that you have. Not necessarily everything that I have, right? And his point is back to this idea of contentment. That if we began to think about it, that what I have is what God's given me, that he's blessed me with, right? Used even different language, right? That he's favored me with. And how to enjoy it. See, what if this is about enjoying what we have, not because we have? That one might have gone over your head. Let me say that again. What if this is about enjoying what we have, not because we have, right? Not enjoying it because, hey, we have it, look at the stuff, I get to enjoy it. No. What if this is just simply about enjoying what we have already and being thankful for that? God wants us to enjoy this life. Sometimes I think people like me in places like this have painted the picture that God doesn't want you to enjoy this life. There's a much better life coming. Let's hold on for that. It'll be much better than this. That's not, what the writers of the Bible, especially the New Testament, talked about. In fact, he goes on, again, talking specifically to those who are rich, Amazon Prime accounts, right? He says, tell them, the rich people, to do good, to be rich in doing good deeds, to be generous and ready to share. It's about the money and what the money lets us do. What if it's about what riches can do to us and what we do with it, right? Does our richness, does it do something good to us or does it do something not so good to us, right?